My brother looked me straight in the eye and said, "If you don't like living with us, you can leave." He said this while standing in the kitchen of the house I owned, the house where he had lived rent-free for 3 years. I smiled, pulled out my phone and texted my lawyer. Within 48 hours, I had served him with a formal eviction notice. That's when my phone started ringing non-stop, my parents calling me selfish, ungrateful, and cruel for daring to reclaim my own home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Morales, and I am 35 years old. I work as a senior software architect for a technology consulting firm here in Austin, Texas, specializing in designing scalable systems for enterprise clients. The work is demanding, intellectually challenging, and financially rewarding. I have spent the last 12 years building a career in an industry that values innovation, problem-solving ability, and continuous learning. My professional identity is something I constructed deliberately, with careful attention to skill development and strategic career moves that position me for advancement in a competitive field. This was not the path my family envisioned for me. My parents, Carmen and Eduardo Morales, both worked in traditional professions that they understood and valued. My father spent 37 years as a machinist at an automotive parts manufacturing plant, working with his hands to create tangible products according to precise specifications. My mother worked as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic, managing schedules, patient records, and the complex coordination required to keep a busy practice running smoothly. They both valued stability, predictability, and work that produced clear, visible results. From their perspective, my choice to pursue computer science represented an unnecessary risk. They viewed technology careers as unstable, overly specialized, and removed from the real world of physical production and direct human service. When I announced my intention to study computer science at the University of Texas, my father's response was immediate and unequivocal. He told me that I was making a mistake, that technology jobs would disappear as quickly as they appeared, and that I would struggle to find meaningful employment in such a narrow field. My mother expressed concern that I was choosing a male-dominated profession, where I would face discrimination and limited advancement opportunities. My younger brother, Marco, who is now 33, chose a path that aligned perfectly with our parents' values and understanding of work. He became a diesel mechanic, following in our father's footsteps by working with machinery and tools to solve concrete mechanical problems. Our parents celebrated this choice, praising Marco for selecting practical, stable work that would always be in demand. They told him frequently that people would always need vehicles repaired, that his skills would transfer across industries, and that he had demonstrated wisdom in choosing a trade rather than pursuing abstract academic credentials. The differential treatment began long before career choices became relevant. When I was 11 and Marco was 9, we both wanted new bicycles for our birthdays, which fall only 3 weeks apart in early summer. Marco received a brand new Trek mountain bike with full suspension, multiple gears, and professional-grade components. The bike cost over $600, a significant expense for our family at that time. When my birthday arrived, I received a used bicycle that my parents had purchased at a garage sale for $40. The bike was functional but outdated, with rust spots on the frame and worn brake pads that made stopping unpredictable. When I expressed disappointment, my father explained that girls did not need expensive bicycles because I would not ride as aggressively or as frequently as Marco would. He said that Marco needed quality equipment because he was more physically active and would use the bike for years, while I would probably lose interest quickly. My mother remained silent during this explanation, neither supporting nor contradicting my father's reasoning. Marco rode his new bike around the neighborhood that afternoon, clearly pleased with his gift, while I stood in the garage looking at my garage sale bicycle and trying to understand why my interests and activities were presumed less worthy of investment. The pattern continued and intensified as we moved through adolescence. When Marco was 16, he crashed the family car while driving too fast on a residential street. The accident was entirely his fault, caused by excessive speed and inattention. The car sustained several $1,000s in damage, requiring extensive bodywork and mechanical repairs. My parents were upset initially, but within days they had forgiven him completely. My father told Marco that everyone makes mistakes while learning to drive, that the important thing was that he was not injured, and that he would be more careful in the future. They repaired the car and continued allowing Marco to drive it regularly. 6 months later, when I was 17, I received a parking ticket for parking in a spot where the signage was unclear and contradictory. The ticket was for $35. When my parents discovered the ticket, they were furious. My father told me that I had demonstrated irresponsibility and poor judgment. He said that I would need to pay the ticket from my part-time job earnings, and that I would lose driving privileges for 1 month as punishment for my carelessness. When I pointed out that Marco had caused thousands of dollars in damage without losing driving privileges, my father said that the situations were completely different. Marco's accident was a mistake that could happen to anyone, he explained, while my parking violation demonstrated a lack of attention to rules and regulations that suggested I was not ready for the responsibility of regular driving. The university years brought the pattern into even sharper relief. I was accepted to the University of Texas with a partial academic scholarship that covered approximately 60% of tuition costs. The remaining expenses for tuition, fees, books, housing, and living costs represented a substantial financial commitment. When I asked my parents whether they could help with these expenses, my father's response was absolute and final. He told me that if I insisted on pursuing an impractical degree in a field they did not understand or support, I would need to finance my education myself. They were not going to invest their hard-earned money in what they viewed as an expensive mistake. I understood that their refusal was not purely about money. They had savings set aside specifically for their children's education, money they had accumulated over years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. Their refusal to help me was about expressing disapproval of my choice and attempting to pressure me into selecting a different path. They believed that if they refused financial support, I would reconsider my plans and choose something they considered more appropriate. When I proceeded with my enrollment anyway, they interpreted this as defiance and stubbornness rather than conviction and self-determination. I worked multiple jobs throughout my university years to cover the costs they refused to support. During the academic year, I worked 25 hours per week as a tutor in the computer science department, helping other students understand programming concepts, data structures, and algorithm design. I also worked weekend shifts at a coffee shop near campus, arriving at 5 in the morning to open the shop and prepare for the morning rush of customers seeking caffeine before their early classes. During summer breaks, I worked full-time as a technology support specialist for a local school district, helping teachers and administrators with hardware problems, software installations, and network connectivity issues. The combination of work and full-time academic study was exhausting. I typically slept 5 to 6 hours per night during the academic year, managing a constant state of mild sleep deprivation that left me perpetually tired. I carefully calculated every expense, buying used textbooks when possible, eating inexpensive meals that I prepared in bulk, and limiting any spending that was not absolutely necessary. I took out student loans to cover the gap between what I could earn and what university attendance cost, understanding that I would be repaying this debt for years after graduation. The total amount I borrowed was approximately $48,000, a sum that represented both my investment in my own future and the cost of my family's refusal to support my educational choices. During this same period, Marco attended a 2-year technical program at a community college to earn certification as a diesel mechanic. The total cost of his program was approximately $12,000 for 2 years of education. My parents paid every dollar of this cost without hesitation. They also covered his living expenses during these 2 years, allowing him to continue living at home rent-free while paying for his car insurance, gas, phone bill, and providing him with spending money for entertainment and socializing. When Marco graduated from his program, my parents hosted a large celebration at our home, inviting extended family members and friends to honor his achievement. They gave him a set of professional quality tools worth over $3,000 as a graduation gift, telling him how proud they were of his accomplishment and his practical career choice. When I graduated from the University of Texas 4 years later with a bachelor's degree in computer science and a grade point average of 3.8, my parents did not attend the ceremony. My mother said they could not take time off from work for something that lasted several hours, even though the ceremony was scheduled on a Saturday. They sent me a card with $50 inside and a brief note congratulating me on finishing my degree. There was no celebration, no gathering of family, No special dinner or acknowledgement of what I had accomplished despite their lack of support. Marco did not acknowledge my graduation at all. I began my career at a small software development company in Austin, working as a junior developer on web applications for local businesses. The starting salary was $42,000 per year, modest by technology standards but sufficient to begin building financial stability. I lived in a small studio apartment in a less desirable neighborhood, furnished with items purchased secondhand or salvaged from curbsides where people left unwanted furniture. I continued living frugally, directing every available dollar toward paying down my student loans and building a modest emergency fund. Over the following years, I changed jobs strategically every 18 to 24 months, each move bringing increased responsibility and substantially higher compensation. By age 28, I was working as a systems architect earning $95,000 annually. By 32, I had moved into a senior architect role with a base salary of $140,000 plus performance bonuses that typically added another $20,000 to $30,000 to my annual income. I had become recognized in the Austin technology community as someone who could design elegant solutions to complex problems, someone who understood both the technical details and the business implications of architectural decisions. At age 33, I purchased my first home. The house was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom single-family home in the Brentwood neighborhood of Austin, purchased for $375,000. I put down 20% as a down payment, money I had saved carefully over several years specifically for this purpose. The house had good bones but needed cosmetic updating. I spent several months renovating, doing some of the work myself and hiring contractors for the projects that required specialized skills. I painted every room, refinished the hardwood floors, updated the kitchen with new countertops and appliances, and converted the 3rd bedroom into a home office where I could work remotely when needed. The house represented more than just a place to live. It was tangible proof that my choices had been correct despite my family's skepticism. It was evidence that computer science was not an impractical field, but rather a path to financial security and professional accomplishment. It was a space that belonged entirely to me, acquired through my own effort without any assistance from family members who had refused to support my education or early career. My relationship with my parents during these years was polite but distant. We spoke by phone occasionally, usually brief conversations where they asked basic questions about my work, and I provided vague answers that did not invite further discussion. They did not understand what I did professionally, and I had long since stopped trying to explain the details of enterprise architecture or cloud infrastructure. When they asked how work was going, I would say it was fine and change the subject. We saw each other at major holidays, gatherings where extended family members would be present, and the focus would be on shared meals, rather than meaningful conversation about our individual lives. Marco, meanwhile, had struggled to establish himself professionally. He completed his certification program and found initial employment at a truck repair facility, but he had difficulty maintaining steady work. He changed jobs frequently, usually because of conflicts with supervisors or coworkers. He would complain that managers did not appreciate his skills, that other mechanics were incompetent and made him look bad, or that customers were unreasonable in their expectations. Each job change was accompanied by a period of unemployment, during which he collected unemployment benefits, while supposedly searching for better opportunities. At age 28, Marco moved out of our parents' home into an apartment with 2 roommates. The arrangement lasted approximately 4 months before conflicts with the roommates led to Marco moving back home. He told our parents that the roommates had been messy and inconsiderate, playing loud music late at night and leaving common areas in disarray. Our parents welcomed him back without question, resuming their pattern of covering his living expenses while he worked irregular hours at various automotive repair facilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Marco was 30, our parents began expressing concern about his lack of direction and stability. They worried that he was not saving money, that he had no long-term plan, and that he would struggle to support himself if they were no longer able to help him. During this period, my mother called me several times to discuss her worries about Marco's future. She never explicitly asked for my help during these conversations, but the implication was clear. She was preparing me for an eventual request, softening the ground for a future appeal to my resources. The request came 6 months later. My mother called on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight with stress. She explained that Marco was having financial difficulties. He had accumulated credit card debt of approximately $18,000, mostly from purchases of tools, automotive parts for personal projects, and general living expenses during periods of unemployment. He was also behind on car payments and faced the possibility of repossession. My parents had been helping him make minimum payments, but they could not continue to support both his debts and their own retirement savings. She asked whether I could help Marco get back on his feet. I felt the familiar tension of conflicting impulses. On one hand, I felt anger at being asked to rescue Marco from consequences of his own poor financial management, especially after years of watching him receive preferential treatment. On the other hand, I genuinely cared about my brother despite our difficult history, and I did not want to see him lose his transportation or damage his credit permanently. I also recognized that helping Marco would reduce stress on my parents, who were approaching retirement age, and should not be depleting their savings to cover their adult son's debts. I agreed to help with one condition. I told my mother that I would pay off Marco's debts entirely, but that I wanted to meet with him directly to discuss the situation and his plans for avoiding similar problems in the future. She agreed immediately, clearly relieved that I was willing to provide assistance. We arranged to meet that weekend at my parents' house. The meeting was awkward and tense. Marco sat across from me at my parents' dining room table, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I asked him to explain how he had accumulated $18,000 in credit card debt. He provided vague answers about unexpected expenses and periods between jobs, when he had needed to use credit cards to cover basic living costs. When I pressed for specifics, he became defensive, saying that he did not need to justify his financial decisions to his sister. I told him directly that I was willing to pay off his debts completely, but that I expected him to create a budget, close the credit card accounts that had caused problems, and commit to living within his means going forward. He agreed readily, perhaps too readily, suggesting that he was saying what he needed to say to secure the assistance rather than genuinely committing to change his financial behavior. I transferred $20,000 to him within 3 business days, covering his credit card debt plus his overdue car payments and giving him a small cushion to stabilize his immediate financial situation. My parents thanked me profusely, telling me that I was a good sister and that family members needed to support each other during difficult times. Marco sent me a text message saying thanks, a single word without elaboration or acknowledgement of the significance of what I had provided. Within weeks, the family dynamic had returned to its established pattern. Marco was still the one who received regular parental attention and concern, while I remained the distant daughter whose life was mysterious and separate from the family's core. 2 years passed with minimal contact beyond holiday gatherings. I continued advancing professionally, taking on larger projects and building my reputation within the Austin technology community. I was invited to speak at conferences, asked to mentor junior developers, and approached by recruiters representing companies that wanted to hire me for leadership positions. My career had reached a point where I had genuine choices about where to work and what projects to pursue, a form of professional freedom that I had worked for years to achieve. Then my mother called again. Marco was facing another crisis. He had been living in an apartment in Pflugerville, a suburb north of Austin, but had lost his job after an argument with his supervisor about work quality. He had fallen behind on rent and was facing eviction. He had no savings and no immediate employment prospects. My mother asked whether Marco could stay with me temporarily, just until he found new work and saved enough money to secure another apartment. She estimated this would take perhaps 2 or 3 months. I hesitated. My home was my sanctuary, the one space that was entirely mine and free from family drama. The thought of sharing that space with Marco, whose financial irresponsibility had already cost me $20,000, filled me with apprehension. However, I also recognized that refusing would likely result in Marco moving back in with my parents permanently, which would prevent them from enjoying the independence they deserved in their early retirement years. I decided that helping Marco transition to stability was preferable to allowing the situation to default into permanent dependence on our aging parents. I agreed with explicit conditions. Marco could stay in my guest bedroom rent-free for 3 months. During this time, he needed to find employment and save money for a security deposit and first month's rent on a new apartment. I would not charge him rent during these 3 months, but he would need to contribute $100 weekly toward household expenses like groceries and utilities. He would need to respect my home, maintain cleanliness in shared spaces, and understand that this was temporary assistance with a clear endpoint. Marco moved into my home on a Saturday in late September. He arrived with his belongings packed in garbage bags and cardboard boxes, lacking even basic luggage or storage containers. I helped him carry everything into the guest bedroom, a space I had carefully decorated with neutral colors and comfortable furnishings for when friends visited from out of town. He looked around the room and made a comment about how nice it must be to afford such a big house on a single income, a statement that felt both like acknowledgement of my success and resentment of the disparity between our situations. The first month proceeded relatively smoothly. Marco spent his days applying for mechanic positions at various automotive repair facilities and dealerships around Austin. He contributed his weekly $100 toward household expenses without complaint. He kept the guest room reasonably tidy and cleaned up after himself in the kitchen and bathroom. We existed in a state of polite coexistence, each of us maintaining our own schedules and interacting primarily during evening meals that we sometimes shared. During the second month, small tensions began to emerge. Marco started commenting on my work habits, particularly my tendency to work late hours from my home office. He would make jokes about how I spent more time on my computer than interacting with people, suggesting that my career had made me antisocial. When I explained that complex architecture work required extended periods of focused concentration, he would dismiss this explanation, saying that real work involved physical presence and tangible results. His comments echoed our parents' long-standing skepticism about my career, implying that technology work was somehow less legitimate than mechanical work because it did not produce visible, touchable products. Marco also began treating my home increasingly casually, as if it were a shared space rather than my property where he was a temporary guest. He would leave his tools and automotive parts spread across my garage, promising to organize them later but never actually doing so. He started inviting friends over without asking my permission first, hosting impromptu gatherings in my living room where his friends would drink beer and watch sports while leaving trash and dishes for me to clean up afterward. When I asked him to check with me before inviting people to my home, he responded that I was being controlling, and that he needed social interaction rather than sitting alone in his room every evening. The most significant tension emerged around Marco's job search, or rather his lack of serious effort toward finding employment. Despite claiming to spend his days looking for work, he rarely left the house except for occasional interviews. He would sleep until 10 or 11 in the morning, spend the afternoon watching television or working on his car in my driveway, and then claim that he had been networking online or following up on applications. When I asked specific questions about where he had applied or what responses he had received, he would become vague and defensive, saying that the job market was difficult and that good positions were scarce. As we approached the end of the third month, the original deadline for Marco's stay in my home, he had not secured employment or saved any money toward a new apartment. When I reminded him that our agreement had been for 3 months, he asked for an extension. He said he had several promising leads that were about to turn into job offers, and that he just needed a bit more time to convert these opportunities into actual employment. Against my better judgment, I agreed to extend the arrangement by 1 additional month, making clear that this was absolutely the final extension, and that he needed to make tangible progress toward independence. During this 4th month, something shifted in Marco's attitude. Rather than treating the extension as a generous opportunity to finalize his transition plans, he seemed to interpret it as evidence that my boundaries were negotiable, and that I would continue accommodating him indefinitely. He stopped contributing his weekly $100 toward household expenses, saying that he needed to conserve his remaining money for job search expenses. When I pointed out that this violated our explicit agreement, he said I was being petty about small amounts of money when I obviously had plenty to spare. His behavior became increasingly entitled. He helped himself to my food without asking, eating expensive items I had purchased for specific meals and leaving me with empty containers. He used my car without permission when his own vehicle needed repairs, putting additional miles on my vehicle, and returning it with an empty gas tank. He started making decisions about my home as if it were his own, adjusting the thermostat to his preferred temperature regardless of the energy costs, rearranging furniture in common areas to better suit his preferences, and even suggesting that I should get rid of certain decorative items that he found unappealing. My parents visited one Sunday afternoon during this 4th month. They seemed pleased to see Marco settled in my home, commenting on how nice it was that we were spending time together as siblings. My mother made a comment about how this arrangement was working out well, and that perhaps Marco should stay longer since it clearly benefited both of us. She suggested that having Marco around provided me with companionship and gave me a reason to be more social, rather than working constantly. I felt a chill of realization that my parents viewed this temporary arrangement as something that might become permanent, a solution to Marco's ongoing instability that conveniently did not require their continued financial support or the use of their space. That evening, after my parents left, I sat down with Marco to have a serious conversation about his plans. I reminded him that he had now been living in my home for 4 months, that our original agreement had been for 3 months, and that I needed to understand his specific timeline for moving out. I asked directly what job prospects he was actively pursuing, and what concrete steps he was taking each day to move toward financial independence. Marco's response shocked me with its directness. He told me that I was being unreasonable in pushing him out when I had plenty of space and more money than I needed. He said that family members were supposed to help each other without imposing arbitrary deadlines or treating assistance like a business transaction. He suggested that I was being selfish in wanting my space back when allowing him to stay cost me essentially nothing. He claimed that our parents agreed with him that I should be more generous and understanding about his situation. I felt anger rising but kept my voice level. I explained that my home was not a family resource available for indefinite use, but rather my private property that I had worked for years to purchase. I reminded him that I had already paid off $18,000 of his debts 2 years ago, that I had been housing him rent-free for 4 months, and that this generosity did not obligate me to provide permanent housing. I told him that he had 2 weeks to find alternative arrangements, whether that meant securing employment in his own apartment, moving back in with our parents, or finding other friends or family members who could accommodate him. Marco stared at me for a long moment, and then he spoke the words that would change everything between us forever. "If you don't like living with us, you can leave." The statement was so absurd, so completely inverted from reality that I almost laughed. He had just told me that I could leave my own home, the home I owned, the home where I had been graciously hosting him for 4 months at no charge. The audacity of the statement revealed how completely his perspective had shifted. He now viewed my home as shared space where he had equal or even primary claim, where I was the one who needed to adjust my expectations rather than him needing to respect clear boundaries. I pulled out my phone without responding verbally. I opened my email application and composed a message to my attorney, an excellent lawyer named Patricia Chun whom I had worked with when purchasing my home. I explained the situation briefly and asked her to prepare a formal eviction notice that would provide Marco with the legally required 30 days to vacate my property. I copied Marco on the email so he could see exactly what I was doing. I pressed send while he watched, his expression shifting from smug confidence to confusion to anger as he realized I was serious. "You can't do that," he said, his voice rising. "I'm family. You can't just kick me out." "I absolutely can," I replied calmly. "This is my house. You are not on the lease, you do not pay rent, and you have no legal claim to remain here beyond what I choose to allow. I have been incredibly generous in housing you for 4 months. That generosity is now concluded. You have 30 days to find alternative housing." Marco stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Our parents are going to hear about this. They're going to know exactly how you're treating me." "Please do tell them," I said. "I would like them to know that after I paid off your debts and housed you rent-free for months, you responded by telling me I could leave my own home." He stormed out of the room and slammed the door to the guest bedroom. I sat at my kitchen table feeling a strange combination of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that I had finally set a clear boundary that would not be negotiated away. Sadness that my relationship with my brother had deteriorated to the point where legal action was necessary to reclaim my own space. Within an hour, my phone began ringing. My mother called first, her voice high and distressed. She had already spoken with Marco, who had given her his version of events where I was unreasonably evicting him over a minor disagreement. She asked how I could do this to my brother, how I could put him out on the street when he was struggling to get back on his feet. She told me that family members were supposed to support each other through difficulties, not abandon each other over pride or minor conflicts. I explained calmly what had actually occurred, including Marco's statement that I could leave my own home. My mother's response was to minimize this comment, saying that Marco had probably just spoken carelessly in a moment of frustration, and that I was overreacting by involving lawyers. She suggested that I was being too sensitive, and that I should reconsider the eviction. When I held firm, she told me that I was breaking her heart, and that she had not raised me to be so cold and unforgiving. My father called 20 minutes later. His approach was more direct and authoritarian. He told me that I needed to cancel the eviction immediately, and allow Marco to stay as long as he needed. When I refused, he raised his voice, saying that I was acting like my success and my house made me better than the rest of the family. He said that pride was a sin, and that I was letting pride destroy my relationship with my brother. He claimed that if I went through with the eviction, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I remained calm throughout both conversations, repeating the same essential points. I had been extraordinarily generous in paying Marco's debts and housing him rent-free. Marco had violated our agreement by not contributing toward expenses, by failing to seriously pursue employment, and ultimately by suggesting that I should leave my own home. The eviction would proceed as planned, and Marco had 30 days to find alternative housing. If our parents wanted to help him, they were welcome to have him move back into their home. The calls continued throughout the evening, including 2 calls from Marco himself alternating between anger and appeals to family loyalty. I stopped answering after the first several calls, letting them go to voicemail. The messages ranged from accusatory to pleading, but the underlying theme was consistent. I was being unreasonable, selfish, and cruel in enforcing boundaries around my own property. That night, lying in bed in my own home, I felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in months, I felt clear about what I was doing and why. I was not being cruel or selfish. I was simply refusing to be exploited further by family members who had never valued my achievements, never respected my choices, and now felt entitled to my resources without gratitude or reciprocity. The next 48 hours would prove even more challenging than I had anticipated. But in that moment, I knew I had made the correct decision. My home would remain mine. My boundaries would be respected. And my family would finally learn that generosity without gratitude eventually reaches its natural end. The morning after I sent the eviction notice, I woke at 6 o'clock as usual and followed my normal routine. I made coffee, checked my work emails, and prepared for a full day of meetings with clients on the East Coast. The house was quiet, and for a moment I could almost pretend that the previous evening's confrontation had not occurred. That illusion shattered when I walked into my kitchen and found Marco sitting at the table with a smug expression on his face. He had apparently been awake for some time, based on the multiple coffee cups scattered around him and the crumbs from what appeared to be the last of the expensive artisan bread I had purchased at the farmer's market over the weekend. He looked up as I entered and smiled in a way that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. "I talked to Mom and Dad last night for a long time after you stopped answering their calls," he said without preamble. "They agree that you're being completely unreasonable about this whole situation. They told me not to worry, that you'll come around once you calm down and think rationally about what you're doing to the family." I poured myself coffee without responding, focusing on the simple mechanical actions of measuring grounds and adding water to avoid saying something I might regret. Marco continued talking, his voice taking on a lecturing quality that reminded me uncomfortably of our father's tone when he was explaining why his decisions were correct and any disagreement represented flawed thinking. "The thing is, Elena, you've always had this problem where you think you're smarter than everyone else just because you went to university and got some computer degree. You act like working in technology makes you superior to people who do real work with their hands. But at the end of the day, family is supposed to be more important than money or property or whatever else you think matters more." I turned to face him, keeping my expression neutral even as anger flared inside me. "Marco, you told me last night that if I didn't like the situation, I could leave my own house. That statement revealed exactly how you view this arrangement. You no longer see yourself as a guest receiving temporary assistance. You see yourself as having an equal or greater claim to this space than I do. That perspective is not acceptable, and it's precisely why the eviction stands." He waved his hand dismissively, as though swatting away an annoying insect. "You're taking one comment completely out of context and using it as an excuse to kick me out. I obviously didn't mean it literally. I was just frustrated because you were pressuring me with deadlines and ultimatums when I'm already stressed about finding work. You should be supporting me right now, not making everything harder." "I have supported you," I replied, my voice remaining calm despite the frustration building inside me. "I paid off $18,000 of your debt 2 years ago. I have housed you rent-free for 4 months. I have been patient far beyond what most people would consider reasonable. That support does not obligate me to provide indefinite free housing, while you make minimal effort to change your circumstances." Marco's expression hardened. "There you go again, throwing money in my face like it makes you better than me. You know what your problem is? You've never understood what it's like to struggle, because everything has always been easy for you. You got lucky with your computer job, and now you look down on everyone else who wasn't lucky enough to pick the right career." The statement was so contrary to reality that I almost laughed. Everything had been easy for me? I had worked multiple jobs throughout university to pay for the education our parents refused to support. I had studied late into the night after exhausting shifts at the coffee shop, forcing myself to focus on algorithms and data structures when my body was screaming for sleep. I had built my career through strategic job changes and continuous learning, not through luck or privilege. But I recognized that attempting to explain this to Marco would be pointless. He had constructed a narrative where my success was unearned and his struggles were the result of external circumstances beyond his control, and no amount of factual correction would penetrate that narrative. "Regardless of how you interpret my career or my circumstances, the situation remains unchanged," I said. "You have received formal notice that you have 30 days to vacate this property. I suggest you use that time productively to secure alternative housing rather than debating whether the eviction is justified." I took my coffee and walked to my home office, closing the door behind me and hearing it lock with a satisfying click. I had installed a keyed lock on the office door when I first purchased the house, wanting to ensure that my work equipment and confidential client documents remained secure. That decision now served an additional purpose of creating at least one space in my home where I could work without Marco's presence or commentary. My first meeting of the day was a video conference with a client in Boston who needed guidance on migrating their legacy systems to a modern cloud architecture. The technical complexity of the conversation required my full attention, which provided welcome distraction from the domestic drama unfolding in my personal life. For 2 hours, I immersed myself in discussions of microservices, containerization strategies, and database optimization, problems that had clear solutions based on technical principles rather than the murky interpersonal dynamics that govern family relationships. When the meeting concluded, I checked my phone and found 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. My mother had called 9 times. My father had called 6 times. Marco had called twice. The text messages ranged from pleading to accusatory, with my mother begging me to reconsider and my father demanding that I cancel the eviction immediately. Several messages from my mother warned that I was destroying the family, and that I would carry the guilt of this decision for the rest of my life. My father's messages were shorter and more direct, stating that I was being selfish and that I had forgotten the values they had raised me to uphold. I responded with a single text message sent to both parents simultaneously. "I understand you are upset about the eviction. However, the decision is final. Marco has 30 days to find alternative housing. If you would like to help him during this transition, I encourage you to do so. I will not be discussing this matter further." I muted notifications from both parents and from Marco, allowing their calls to go directly to voicemail without making my phone buzz or ring. I needed to focus on my work, and the constant interruptions were making that impossible. The decision to mute their communications felt simultaneously empowering and unsettling. I was asserting control over my attention and my time, refusing to allow their demands for immediate response to disrupt my professional responsibilities. At the same time, I felt a twinge of guilt about cutting off communication, a vestige of the conditioning that had taught me to prioritize family demands over my own needs and boundaries. The rest of that day passed in a strange state of suspended tension. I remained in my office for most of the afternoon, working through project documentation and responding to client emails. Marco remained somewhere else in the house, occasionally moving around in ways that I could hear through the walls but never approaching my office door. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken conflict, a temporary ceasefire that both of us knew would not last. That evening I ordered dinner from a local restaurant and had it delivered rather than cooking in my own kitchen, not wanting to risk another confrontation with Marco in the shared spaces of the house. I ate at my desk while reviewing code samples for a project proposal, using work as both distraction and justification for my continued isolation within my own home. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on me. I was effectively hiding in one room of my house to avoid conflict with someone who should not have been there at all, someone who was living in my home only because of my generosity. The pattern continued for the next several days. I would wake early, make coffee quickly, and retreat to my office before Marco emerged from the guest bedroom. I would work through the day, taking calls and video meetings from the safety of my locked office. I would order delivery food for dinner or eat the meal replacement bars I kept stocked for busy work periods. I minimized my time in shared spaces and avoided Marco as much as possible within the confines of my own home. Marco, for his part, seemed to interpret my withdrawal as evidence that I was reconsidering the eviction. On the third day of this pattern, he knocked on my office door around midday. I opened it to find him standing there with an expression of concerned sympathy that looked practiced and insincere. "Hey, I just wanted to check on you," he said, his tone falsely casual. "You've been locked in there for days. I'm worried you're not taking care of yourself properly. How about we order some real food tonight and have dinner together like normal people? We can talk about all this stuff when we're both calm and rational." The implication was clear. He believed that my enforcement of boundaries was the result of temporary anger that would dissipate if given time, and that once I calmed down I would recognize that evicting him was an overreaction. He was offering me an opportunity to back down while framing it as concern for my well-being, a manipulation tactic that might have worked if I had not spent years learning to recognize such patterns. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine," I replied evenly. "I'm simply busy with work and prefer to focus on my professional responsibilities. The eviction notice stands as written. You have 26 days remaining to secure alternative housing." His expression of concern vanished, replaced by irritation. "You're really going to keep this up? You're seriously going to throw me out over one comment you took the wrong way?" "I'm enforcing clear boundaries around my property and my generosity," I said. "This has nothing to do with taking comments the wrong way, and everything to do with respecting the terms under which you were invited to stay here temporarily." He started to respond, but I closed the office door before he could continue, turning the lock and returning to my desk. My hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline flooding my system in response to the confrontation. I had spent so much of my life avoiding direct conflict with family members, finding ways to accommodate their demands or simply withdrawing, rather than asserting my needs clearly. This new pattern of stating boundaries and holding firm regardless of their reaction felt foreign and uncomfortable, even as some part of me recognized it was necessary and overdue. That evening, I received a call from my Aunt Rosa, my mother's older sister. Rosa had always been the family peacemaker, the person who smoothed over conflicts and encouraged everyone to forgive and move past disagreements. I answered the call with some trepidation, suspecting that my mother had recruited her to add another voice to the chorus demanding that I reconsider the eviction. "Elena Mija, your mother called me very upset about this situation with Marco," Rosa began, her voice warm but concerned. "She's heartbroken that you're putting him out of your house. She asked me to talk to you to help you understand how much this is hurting the family." I took a deep breath, preparing myself for another round of explaining my position. "Tia Rosa, I understand Mom is upset. However, the situation is not as she has described it to you. Marco has been living here rent-free for 4 months, which was already 1 month longer than we originally agreed. During that time, he has made minimal effort to find stable employment or save money for his own place. When I reminded him of our agreement, he told me that if I didn't like the situation, I could leave my own house. That statement made it clear that this arrangement had become untenable." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Rosa spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly, less advocacy and more genuine inquiry. "He really said you should leave your own house?" "Yes. Those were his exact words." Another pause. "That does change things somewhat. Your mother didn't mention that part of the story. I felt a small flicker of hope that perhaps Rosa would understand my position rather than simply pressuring me to accommodate Marco indefinitely. I have been very generous with Marco, both 2 years ago when I paid off his debts and over these past 4 months. That generosity doesn't obligate me to provide permanent free housing, especially when he's made it clear he now views my home as his space rather than understanding himself as a guest receiving temporary help. Rosa sighed, a sound that conveyed both sympathy and weariness. You're right, of course. Marco has always struggled with taking responsibility for his situation. Your parents have enabled that by always bailing him out rather than letting him experience the consequences of his choices. But Elena, you know how your mother is. She cannot stand conflict or estrangement within the family. This situation is causing her enormous stress. I regret that Mom is stressed, I said carefully. However, my responsibility is to maintain appropriate boundaries around my own home and my own resources. I cannot sacrifice my peace and my space indefinitely to avoid causing Mom stress. That's not a sustainable or healthy dynamic. No, you're absolutely right about that, Rosa agreed. I'll talk to your mother and try to help her see that you're not being unreasonable. I can't promise it will help, but I'll try. In the meantime, take care of yourself. I know this must be difficult for you too. The conversation with Rosa left me feeling marginally better, validated in my position by someone whose opinion I respected, and who was not simply taking sides based on family loyalty. However, that small comfort was short-lived. Later that same evening, my mother called from my father's phone, apparently hoping I would answer if I did not recognize the number. Elena, we need to talk about this situation immediately, she said as soon as I answered, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Your father and I have discussed this extensively, and we've decided that you need to cancel this eviction and allow Marco to stay as long as he needs. The statement was so presumptuous that I felt anger flash through me before I consciously registered the emotion. Mom, you and Dad don't get to decide what happens in my house. This is not a family decision. This is my property, and I determine who lives here and under what conditions. Family is not about property ownership, my mother said, her voice rising. Family is about supporting each other and making sacrifices when necessary. You have space and money that Marco doesn't have. Sharing those resources is not optional when your brother needs help. It's your duty as his sister. I have shared my resources extensively, I replied, working to keep my voice level. I paid $18,000 of Marco's debts. I have housed him for 4 months rent-free. That generosity has limits, and those limits have been reached. Marco told me I could leave my own house. That statement made it clear he no longer views this as temporary assistance but rather as an entitlement to my space. He didn't mean it that way, and you know it, my mother insisted. You're being deliberately uncharitable in your interpretation because you want an excuse to kick him out. The truth is that you've never liked sharing your success with family. You've always been selfish about your money and your achievements. The accusation stung precisely because it was so unjust. I had shared extensively with family members who had never supported my education or my career choices. I had provided financial assistance multiple times without demanding repayment or even basic gratitude. The characterization of this generosity as selfishness revealed how completely my mother misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented my actions. Mom, I'm not going to continue this conversation. The eviction stands. Marco has 26 days to find alternative housing. If you want to help him, you're welcome to have him move back into your house. But he will not be staying in mine beyond the legal notice period. If you do this, you're choosing money and property over your family, my mother said, her voice breaking. You're choosing to be alone rather than maintaining your relationships with the people who love you. I hope you can live with that choice. She ended the call before I could respond. I sat holding the phone, feeling a complex mixture of anger, sadness, and something that felt almost like grief. My mother had essentially threatened estrangement if I refused to continue housing Marco indefinitely. She had framed my boundary setting as a choice to abandon the family rather than recognizing it as a refusal to be exploited. The emotional manipulation was transparent, but that transparency did not make it less painful. Over the following week, the campaign to pressure me into canceling the eviction intensified. My parents called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to accusatory. They sent text messages multiple times daily reminding me of family obligations and warning that I was damaging relationships beyond repair. My mother sent me a long email detailing all the ways she and my father had sacrificed for me when I was growing up, framing my refusal to house Marco indefinitely as ingratitude for their past parenting. The email was particularly difficult to read because it contained genuine truths mixed with distortions and omissions. Yes, my parents had provided for me during childhood. Yes, they had made sacrifices to raise 2 children on modest incomes. However, the email completely omitted the differential treatment between Marco and me, the refusal to support my education, and the years of dismissing my career and achievements. It presented a version of family history where they had been uniformly loving and supportive parents, and I was now repaying their devotion with cruelty toward my brother. Marco himself adopted a strategy of acting as though the eviction was not really happening. He made no visible effort to search for apartments or to pack his belongings. He continued living in my home, as though the notice period were simply a formality that would eventually be withdrawn. He left his possessions spread throughout the house, his tools cluttering my garage and his clothes often left in the washing machine or draped over furniture in common areas. When I reminded him that he had 23 days remaining, then 20 days, then 18 days, he would shrug and say that we would figure something out. His refusal to take the situation seriously began to concern me. I had assumed that once the initial anger passed, Marco would recognize that I was serious and would begin making practical arrangements for alternative housing. Instead, he seemed to believe that if he simply ignored the eviction notice, I would eventually back down rather than follow through with legal enforcement. This miscalculation revealed how little he understood about how thoroughly my patience had been exhausted. On the 15th day of the 30-day notice period, I received a call from Patricia Chun, my attorney. She had completed the formal eviction paperwork and had arranged for it to be served to Marco by a professional process server the following day. She explained that once he was formally served, the 30-day clock would begin officially from a legal standpoint, though since I had already provided him with written notice, the timeline remained essentially the same. She asked whether I anticipated any problems with Marco refusing to leave when the notice period expired. I honestly don't know, I told her. He's been acting as though this isn't really happening, as though I'll change my mind if he just waits long enough. I'm concerned he might refuse to leave voluntarily when the time comes. Patricia's response was professional and reassuring. If he refuses to vacate after the notice period expires, we can pursue formal eviction through the courts. That process takes additional time, typically 4 to 6 weeks, but it will result in law enforcement removing him and his belongings if necessary. I would prefer to avoid that path if possible, both because it's time-consuming and because it would further damage your family relationships. However, if he forces that option, we're prepared to pursue it. The thought of having police remove my brother from my home was deeply unpleasant, but I recognized it might become necessary. Marco had demonstrated repeatedly that he did not respect boundaries or take seriously any consequences that were not immediately and forcefully imposed. I thanked Patricia for her work and confirmed that she should proceed with having the formal notice served. The next day, a process server arrived at my home while I was in my office on a video call. I heard the doorbell ring and heard Marco answer it. Through my closed office door, I could hear muffled conversation followed by Marco's raised voice expressing anger and disbelief. The conversation lasted several minutes before I heard the front door close. Shortly after, Marco pounded on my office door hard enough that I worried he might damage it. I muted my microphone on the video call and opened the door. Marco stood there holding the formal eviction paperwork, his face flushed with anger. "You actually had me served? You got lawyers involved like I'm some kind of criminal? You are being evicted legally because you have refused to take seriously the informal notice I provided weeks ago," I said calmly. "The formal process is necessary because you have made it clear you will not leave voluntarily." "This is insane," he said, waving the papers. "You're treating your own brother like a tenant you want to get rid of. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? How embarrassing it is to have some stranger show up at the door with legal paperwork. Perhaps you should have considered potential embarrassment before you told me I could leave my own house," I replied. "I need to return to my meeting now. Please excuse me." I closed and locked the office door, Returning to my video call where my client was patiently waiting, I apologized for the interruption and resumed our discussion of database migration strategies, compartmentalizing the domestic drama sufficiently to focus on the technical conversation. This ability to separate my professional responsibilities from my personal challenges had served me well throughout my career, allowing me to maintain high performance at work even during difficult periods in my personal life. That evening, after my workday ended, I emerged from my office to find my parents sitting in my living room with Marco. They had apparently let themselves into my house using the spare key I had given them years ago for emergencies. The sight of them sitting on my furniture in my home without invitation sent a spike of anger through me. "We need to have a family meeting about this situation," my father announced as soon as he saw me, his tone making clear this was not a request but a demand. "Sit down, Elena. We're going to resolve this tonight." I remained standing, refusing to be commanded in my own home. "You need to leave. You were not invited here. And I'm not going to have a family meeting about my decision regarding my property. Your mother and I have discussed this situation extensively with Marco," my father continued as though I had not spoken. "We've determined that the best solution is for Marco to remain here for another 6 months, while he saves money and finds stable employment. You will not charge him rent during this period, as family members don't charge each other rent. At the end of 6 months, we'll reassess the situation and determine next steps." The presumption inherent in this pronouncement was breathtaking. My father had just announced a plan for my home, my property, that extended Marco's free residency for another 6 months beyond the original agreement, all without my input or consent. He was treating my home as though it were family property subject to collective decision-making rather than private property that I alone controlled. "That plan is not acceptable," I said, my voice cold with barely contained fury. "Marco has been formally served with eviction papers. He has 15 days remaining to vacate. That timeline is not negotiable." My mother stood up, her eyes filling with tears. "Elena, please. He's your brother. He needs time to get back on his feet. 6 months is not unreasonable for family. 6 months is completely unreasonable when added to the 4 months he's already been here," I replied. "That would be nearly a year of free housing for someone who told me I could leave my own home. The answer is no." "Then you leave us no choice," my father said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "If you proceed with this eviction, you are no longer part of this family. You will not be welcome at family gatherings. You will not be included in family decisions. You will be choosing your property over your family, and you will have to live with the consequences of that choice." The ultimatum hung in the air between us. My father was threatening to disown me if I refused to provide unlimited free housing to my brother. The absurdity of the threat would have been comical if it were not so painful. I was being told that enforcing basic boundaries around my own home meant I was abandoning my family, while Marco's exploitation and my parents' enabling were framed as normal family dynamics that I should accept without question. If maintaining membership in this family requires me to accept exploitation and disrespect in my own home, then perhaps this family is not worth maintaining membership in, I said, hearing my own voice as though from a distance. "You need to leave now. All 3 of you. You are not welcome in my home." My mother gasped as though I had physically struck her. My father's face turned red with anger. Marco looked between our parents and me with an expression of vindicated satisfaction, as though my standing firm had proven his claim that I was selfish and uncaring. "You'll regret this," my father said as he stood. "You're making a choice you won't be able to take back." "I understand that," I replied. "Please leave." They left slowly, my mother crying quietly and my father maintaining an air of stern disapproval. Marco followed them, though technically he still had 15 days of legal residency remaining. I watched through my front window as they sat in their car in my driveway for several minutes, clearly having an intense conversation. Finally, they drove away, leaving me standing alone in my living room feeling simultaneously empowered and devastated. I had just been threatened with expulsion from my family for refusing to accept indefinite exploitation. The threat revealed something I had suspected for years, but had never wanted to fully acknowledge. My value to my family was instrumental rather than intrinsic. I was valued for what I could provide in terms of money and resources, not for who I was as a person. When I stopped providing those resources on demand without conditions, I stopped being valuable to them. That night, I changed the locks on my doors and collected the spare key I had given my parents. I would not allow them to enter my home uninvited again. The symbolic weight of changing the locks felt enormous, a physical manifestation of the boundaries I was establishing. This home was mine, and access to it would be controlled by me based on my decisions about who respected me and my space sufficiently to be welcomed here. The days following my confrontation with my parents settled into an eerie quiet that felt both liberating and unsettling. Marco had left with our parents that night and had not returned, leaving behind most of his belongings scattered throughout my home. His tools still cluttered my garage, his clothes remained in the guest bedroom closet, and various personal items were distributed across surfaces in common areas. The physical evidence of his presence remained even though he himself was absent, creating a strange liminal state where the house felt simultaneously mine again and still occupied by the conflict. I spent the weekend after that confrontation methodically reclaiming my space. I gathered all of Marco's belongings from throughout the house and packed them carefully into boxes and garbage bags, labeling each container with its contents. I was not angry as I worked, merely methodical and determined. Each item I packed represented a piece of the intrusion being removed, my home being restored to the sanctuary it had been before Marco moved in. The guest bedroom, the garage, the living room, the kitchen. Every space was cleared of his possessions and returned to its intended state. The work was physically exhausting but emotionally cathartic. I moved furniture back to its original positions, adjusting the thermostat to my preferred temperature, reorganizing the kitchen cabinets that Marco had rearranged to suit his preferences. I scrubbed surfaces that had accumulated the grime of someone else's careless use. I opened windows to air out rooms that had taken on the smell of someone else's presence. By Sunday evening, the house looked and felt like mine again, with all of Marco's belongings neatly packed and stacked in the garage awaiting his retrieval. I sent a text message to Marco informing him that his possessions were packed and ready for pickup at his convenience during the remaining days of his notice period. I received no response. I sent a similar message to my parents, letting them know that Marco's things were ready, and providing a window of time when I would be home to facilitate the pickup. Again, no response. The silence from my family was absolute and clearly intentional, a coordinated withdrawal designed to punish me for my refusal to comply with their demands. The silence should have felt peaceful after months of pressure and conflict, but instead it carried an undercurrent of threat. I knew my family well enough to recognize that their quiet was not acceptance but rather strategy. They were waiting, believing that if they maintained their withdrawal long enough, I would become uncomfortable with the estrangement and reach out to repair the relationship on their terms. They had used this pattern before in minor family disagreements, freezing out whoever had caused displeasure, until that person apologized and conformed to family expectations. What they had not accounted for was that I had spent years building a life and identity separate from family approval. My professional success, my friendships with colleagues and others in the Austin technology community, my sense of self-worth derived from my achievements rather than from family validation. These things insulated me from the isolation they believed would bring me back into compliance. The silence was uncomfortable, yes, but it was far less uncomfortable than continuing to accept exploitation and disrespect in my own home. Work provided structure and purpose during this period. I threw myself into my projects with renewed focus, grateful for complex technical problems that had clear solutions based on logical principles, rather than the murky emotional dynamics of family relationships. I led design sessions with client teams, reviewed architecture proposals from junior consultants, and presented at a regional technology conference on microservices patterns. My professional reputation continued growing, with my name becoming increasingly recognized in circles where technical expertise and strategic thinking were valued. One of my projects during this period involved redesigning the technology infrastructure for a rapidly growing healthcare startup. The company had built their initial systems quickly to support early growth, but those systems were now buckling under increased user load and data volume. They needed someone who could envision a scalable architecture that would support their next phase of growth, while also creating a migration path from their current systems that would not disrupt ongoing operations. The challenge was exactly the kind of complex problem I found most engaging, requiring both technical depth and strategic thinking about business priorities and risk management. I spent long hours on this project, sometimes working late into the evening from my home office. The work was demanding but satisfying in ways that family interactions had never been. When I solved a difficult technical problem, the solution was objectively correct or incorrect, based on whether it met the requirements and constraints. When I presented recommendations to clients, they evaluated those recommendations based on technical merit and business value, rather than on favoritism or family politics. The meritocratic nature of professional work felt clean and fair in ways that family dynamics never had. 3 weeks passed with complete silence from my family. Marco's possessions remained packed in my garage, unclaimed despite multiple messages providing pickup times. The legal deadline for his eviction came and went without him having retrieved his belongings or made any contact. I consulted with Patricia Chun about the situation, and she advised that I provide one final notice giving Marco 7 additional days to collect his possessions, after which I would be legally entitled to dispose of them as I saw fit. I sent a formal letter via certified mail to Marco at my parents' address, since I did not know where else he might be staying. The letter stated clearly that he had 7 days from receipt to collect his belongings, and that items not collected within that timeframe would be donated or disposed of. The certified mail tracking showed that the letter was delivered and signed for, though I did not know whether Marco himself had received it or whether my parents had accepted delivery on his behalf. During this period of family silence, something unexpected happened at work that would later prove significant. My manager called me into her office for what she described as an important conversation about my career trajectory. Sandra Chun was a sharp, strategic thinker who had built her own career through a combination of technical excellence and political savvy within the consulting firm. She had been a mentor to me for several years, providing guidance on navigating client relationships and positioning myself for advancement. Sandra got directly to the point once I was seated in her office. The firm was creating a new practice area focused on cloud transformation for mid-sized enterprises, a growing market segment where they saw significant opportunity. They were looking for someone to lead this practice as a partner, someone who combined deep technical expertise with the ability to build client relationships and develop junior consultants. She believed I was an ideal candidate for this role, and wanted to know whether I would be interested in being considered. The opportunity was substantial both professionally and financially. Partnership in the firm meant equity ownership, a share of profits rather than just salary, and a voice in strategic decisions about the firm's direction. It also meant increased responsibility for business development and team leadership, moving further from hands-on technical work toward strategic oversight. The financial implications were significant as well, with partner-level compensation typically ranging from $400,000 to $700,000 annually depending on the practice area's performance. I told Sandra I was very interested and asked about the timeline and process for consideration. She explained that the decision would be made over the next 2 months, during which time I would need to present a vision for the practice area to the existing partners and demonstrate my capability to lead both technically and strategically. If selected, I would transition into the role over a 3-month period, gradually assuming responsibility for the practice while wrapping up my current client commitments. The conversation with Sandra energized me in ways I had not anticipated. Here was recognition of my capabilities from people whose judgment was based entirely on professional merit. Here was an opportunity to build something significant, to shape how the firm served an entire market segment. The timing felt almost cosmically appropriate. As my family was rejecting me for refusing to be exploited, my professional world was offering me expanded opportunities based on demonstrated competence and potential. I spent the following weeks preparing my pitch for the partner role, while continuing to manage my existing client projects. The work required for the partnership pitch was substantial. I needed to develop a comprehensive market analysis showing the opportunity in mid-sized enterprise cloud transformation, create a service offering framework that differentiated our approach from competitors, build financial projections showing revenue potential and required investment, and outline a team development strategy for recruiting and training consultants who could deliver our services. The intellectual challenge was considerable, requiring me to synthesize technical knowledge, market understanding, and strategic thinking into a coherent and compelling vision. During this period of intense professional focus, the 7-day deadline for Marco to collect his possessions came and went without any contact from him or my parents. I documented the situation carefully, taking photographs of all the packed boxes with their labels visible, and maintaining records of all the communications I had sent providing opportunities for pickup. Once the deadline passed, I arranged for a local charity to collect the items that had resale value and disposed of the remainder through normal waste management channels. Clearing Marco's possessions from my garage felt like closing a chapter. The physical space that his belongings had occupied was restored to its intended purpose, housing my own car and the tools and equipment I used for home maintenance. The guest bedroom, no longer filled with his clothes and personal items, reverted to being a welcoming space for actual guests, rather than a permanent residence for an entitled family member. My home was fully mine again, every room reflecting my choices and priorities, rather than accommodating someone else's presence. The silence from my family continued absolute. My birthday passed in early November without acknowledgement from my parents or brother. The first time in my life that this milestone had occurred without at least a phone call or card. The absence of contact on my birthday felt significant, a marker of how thoroughly the estrangement had settled into place. I celebrated quietly with friends from work, people who valued me for who I was rather than for what I could provide them, and the evening was genuinely pleasant in ways that family gatherings had not been for years. Thanksgiving approached, traditionally a major family holiday that my mother took seriously as an opportunity to gather extended family for an elaborate meal. In previous years, I had always attended these gatherings regardless of how awkward or uncomfortable they might be, maintaining the appearance of family cohesion, even when underlying tensions were obvious to anyone paying attention. This year I made different plans. A colleague who had moved to Austin from another state and had no family nearby invited several of us to a Friendsgiving celebration, and I accepted gratefully. The meal was relaxed and genuinely warm, conversation flowing easily among people who chose to spend time together, rather than being obligated to do so by family ties. I did not reach out to my parents about Thanksgiving plans, and they did not contact me. The mutual silence was maintained, each side apparently committed to their position. I wondered whether they had gathered for their traditional meal, and how they had explained my absence to extended family members who would notice that I was not there. Did they tell the truth about the conflict over Marco's eviction? Or did they create some alternative explanation that preserved their preferred narrative about family dynamics? I would not know unless someone from extended family reached out, and so far no one had. December arrived with its characteristic craziness in the technology consulting world. Companies rushing to spend remaining budget before year-end and wanting to start new initiatives in January created a compressed timeline where everyone wanted decisions and commitments quickly. My existing client projects intensified as teams pushed to reach year-end milestones, and my preparation for the partnership pitch reached its final stages. I was working 60 to 70-hour weeks, exhausting but exhilarating as I pushed myself to perform at the highest level, while also envisioning the future I wanted to build if given the opportunity to lead the new practice area. The partner presentation was scheduled for mid-December. I spent days refining my pitch, practicing my delivery, and anticipating questions that the existing partners might raise. The presentation itself lasted 90 minutes, during which I walked through my analysis of the market opportunity, detailed the proposed service framework, presented financial projections with underlying assumptions clearly explained, and outlined how I would build and develop the team needed to deliver our services. The existing partners asked probing questions about competitive dynamics, pricing strategy, and risk mitigation, questions I had anticipated and prepared for carefully. The feedback was positive but not definitive. The partners thanked me for the thorough presentation and said they would make their decision within 2 weeks, after reviewing all candidates for various partnership opportunities across the firm. I left the presentation feeling that I had performed well, but knowing that factors beyond my control would influence the final decision. All I could do was wait and continue executing excellently on my current responsibilities. 3 days after my partner presentation, on a Thursday evening when I was working late from my home office reviewing architecture documentation, my doorbell rang. The unexpected interruption was unwelcome given my focus on the complex technical material, but I went to answer it, assuming a delivery or perhaps a neighbor with some question or request. I opened the door to find Madison standing on my front porch. She was Marco's former girlfriend from several years ago, someone I had met only a handful of times at family gatherings but who had always seemed kind and intelligent, far too good for my brother. I had heard through family gossip that they had broken up about 18 months ago, but I had not thought about her much since then. Her presence on my doorstep was completely unexpected. Madison looked nervous, holding a large manila envelope and shifting her weight from foot to foot. Her eyes were worried but determined, and she glanced over her shoulder as though checking whether anyone had followed her before speaking. Elena, I'm sorry to show up unannounced like this. I know it's weird and probably unwelcome, but I have information that you need to see, information about Marco and your parents that I couldn't keep to myself anymore. Can I come in? This will take some time to explain. I hesitated briefly, wary of anything connected to Marco given the recent conflicts. However, Madison's nervous sincerity and the fact that she and Marco had been broken up for a year and a half suggested she was not acting on his behalf. I stepped aside and gestured for her to enter, leading her to my living room where we sat on opposite ends of the couch. Madison placed the manila envelope on the coffee table between us but did not immediately open it. Instead, she looked at me directly and began speaking in a rush, as though she had rehearsed what she wanted to say but was nervous about actually saying it. I need to start by apologizing. When Marco and I were together, I saw things happening in your family that were wrong, and I didn't speak up. I watched your parents treat you differently than they treated Marco. I saw the way they dismissed your accomplishments while celebrating his mediocre achievements. I heard them talk about you like you were a resource to be managed rather than a daughter to be loved. And I stayed silent because I didn't think it was my place to get involved in family dynamics. I regret that silence now. I did not know how to respond, so I simply nodded, acknowledging her statement without commenting on it. Madison continued, her words coming faster as she built momentum. Marco and I broke up because I discovered he was lying to me about multiple things. His employment situation was much worse than he had described. His debts were much larger than he had admitted. And most significantly, I discovered that he had been systematically stealing money from your parents' business accounts for years. When I confronted him about it, he didn't deny it. He justified it by saying the money was family money and that he had a right to it. When I told him I couldn't be with someone who would steal from his own parents, he said I was being dramatic and that I didn't understand how families worked. The revelation about theft was surprising but somehow not shocking. It fit with Marco's pattern of entitlement and his willingness to take without reciprocating. Madison reached for the manila envelope and opened it, pulling out a thick stack of papers. After we broke up, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered. Marco's theft wasn't just wrong ethically. It was hurting your parents financially, and they didn't know about it. They kept wondering why their business was struggling when revenue seemed adequate, why they never seemed to have the cash flow they expected. I eventually decided I needed to document what I had found and give that information to someone who could do something about it. She spread papers across the coffee table. Bank statements, credit card records, receipts, transaction histories. The documents were organized with colored tabs and sticky notes, clearly the product of considerable effort to compile and annotate. I originally intended to give these to your parents directly, but then I started hearing through mutual friends about the situation with you, about how your parents were pressuring you to keep housing Marco indefinitely and threatening to disown you when you refused. I realized that giving this information to your parents might not accomplish anything. They might continue protecting Marco despite evidence of his theft, just like they've protected him from consequences his entire life. So I decided to bring it to you instead, because I think you're the only person in the family who might actually hold Marco accountable. I pulled the papers closer and began examining them, my software engineer's mind instinctively organizing the information into patterns and structures. What I saw was damning and comprehensive. Marco had been transferring money from the family business accounts to personal accounts that our parents apparently did not know about. The transfers were usually small enough to avoid immediate notice, ranging from a few hundred to a few $1,000s, but they had been occurring regularly for at least 4 years. The cumulative total was staggering. I added numbers quickly in my head, then pulled out my phone to use the calculator to verify my initial estimate. The total amount Marco had stolen over 4 years was approximately $137,000. $137,000 taken from the modest business that my parents had built over decades of hard work, the business that was supposed to provide them with income during retirement. How did you get all these records? I asked Madison, my voice sounding distant to my own ears as I processed the magnitude of what I was seeing. I had access to some of the accounts when Marco and I were together. He had given me login credentials when he asked me to help him organize his finances, back before I realized how disorganized they actually were. After we broke up, I should have stopped accessing those accounts, but I wanted to understand the full scope of what he had been doing. I documented everything carefully, and then I changed the passwords on my save login so I wouldn't be tempted to keep checking. What you're looking at is everything I was able to access and document before I cut off my access. I looked at Madison with new respect. She had taken considerable personal risk to document this information, acting out of a sense of ethics even when doing so provided her no direct benefit. The care and thoroughness evident in how she had organized the documentation suggested she understood its potential significance and had wanted to ensure it would be useful to whoever eventually received it. "Why didn't you go to the police with this information?" I asked. "This is clearly criminal theft, not just a family disagreement about money." Madison's expression became complicated, a mixture of regret and uncertainty. I thought about it, but I wasn't sure whether I had obtained the information legally. Since I accessed accounts after Marco and I broke up, I was worried I might get in trouble myself, or that any case against Marco might be compromised by questions about how the evidence was obtained. I decided it was better to give the information to family members who could decide what to do with it, people who had the standing to pursue legal action if they chose to. I nodded, understanding her reasoning even while wishing she had brought this information forward sooner. However, the timing of her revelation was perhaps more useful now than it would have been earlier. Armed with this information, I had leverage and understanding that recontextualized everything that had happened over the past months. Marco had been stealing over $130,000 from our parents while simultaneously accumulating debts that I had paid off and living rent-free in my home, while claiming he was struggling to find stable employment. His struggles were not the result of bad luck or difficult market conditions. They were the result of theft and financial mismanagement, of spending money he had stolen rather than building legitimate income through honest work. My parents had been struggling financially not because their business model was flawed, or because market conditions were difficult, but because their son had been systematically stealing from them. They had blamed economic conditions, rising costs, and increased competition for their financial difficulties, never suspecting that the real cause was sitting at their dinner table eating the meals they provided while taking their money. And when I had refused to continue subsidizing Marco's lifestyle by providing indefinite free housing, my parents had threatened to disown me. They had called me selfish and accused me of valuing property over family. They had demanded that I sacrifice my space and my peace to support the son who was actively stealing from them, and they had punished me with silence and estrangement when I refused. The irony was almost too painful to process. While I had been giving my family money and support based on genuine care despite their years of differential treatment, Marco had been taking from them through outright theft. While I had been dismissed as selfish for setting boundaries, Marco had been celebrated and protected despite betraying their trust in the most fundamental way possible. I looked at Madison, who was watching me carefully as though trying to gauge my reaction to the information she had provided. "Thank you for bringing this to me," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional turbulence I felt. "This must have been difficult for you, and I appreciate that you took the risk of compiling this documentation and bringing it forward. What you've given me changes everything." Madison's expression showed relief mixed with concern. "What are you going to do with this information? Are you going to tell your parents? Report Marco to the police?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I need time to think about the implications and the options. But whatever I decide, you've given me the ability to make an informed decision based on truth, rather than on the false narrative my family has been operating under. That's a gift, even if it's a painful one." We talked for another 30 minutes, with Madison providing additional context about Marco's behavior during their relationship and her observations about family dynamics. She described watching Marco manipulate our parents' concern into support, while showing contempt for them behind their backs. She recounted conversations where Marco had explicitly stated that he deserved financial help from the family, because they owed him for choosing to stay local rather than pursuing opportunities elsewhere, a rationalization that revealed his fundamental sense of entitlement. When Madison left that evening, I sat alone in my living room surrounded by the documented evidence of my brother's theft. The house was quiet around me, the sanctuary I had fought to reclaim now serving as the space where I would decide what to do with information that would inevitably damage my family further, but which they deserved to know. I did not make any immediate decisions that night. Instead, I carefully organized all the documentation Madison had provided, scanning each page and creating digital backups that I stored in multiple secure locations. If I was going to use this information, I wanted to ensure it could not be lost or destroyed by anyone who might wish it had never been discovered. As I worked late into the night, organizing and securing the evidence of Marco's theft, I found myself thinking about justice and family, and the complicated intersection between the two. My family had spent decades prioritizing Marco over me, excusing his failures and dismissing my successes. They had demanded that I give without limit while holding me to standards they never applied to him. And now I held information that would explain so much of what had happened while potentially destroying what remained of family relationships. The question was not whether my family deserved to know the truth. They absolutely did. The question was whether I was willing to be the person who delivered that truth, knowing that doing so would cast me once again as the bad daughter who caused family pain, even though the real cause of that pain was Marco's betrayal and our parents' years of willful blindness. I went to bed that night without answers, but with a clarity I had not possessed before. Whatever decisions I made would be based on truth, rather than on the distorted version of reality my family had maintained for so long. And that truth, however painful, was valuable in ways that comfortable lies could never be. The morning after Madison's revelation brought an unusual clarity to my thinking despite having slept only a few hours. I woke before dawn and made coffee in the quiet darkness of my kitchen, then settled into my home office with the documentation spread across my desk. The evidence of Marco's theft represented more than just financial crimes. It represented years of family dysfunction crystallized into concrete facts that could no longer be dismissed or rationalized away. I spent the early morning hours reviewing the documents with systematic attention to detail, my analytical training asserting itself over emotional response. Each bank statement told part of a larger story. Each transfer record added another piece to the puzzle of how Marco had managed to maintain a lifestyle that his legitimate income could never support. The pattern was clear and damning. Small transfers occurred with regular frequency, timed to coincide with periods when business account balances were highest, and the missing funds would be least noticeable. Larger transfers happened during particularly busy seasons when my parents were too focused on operations to scrutinize every transaction carefully. The sophistication of the theft was limited but adequate. Marco had not needed elaborate schemes or complex financial manipulations. He simply had access to accounts that his parents trusted him with, and he had exploited that trust systematically over years. The betrayal was not just financial but relational. Every dollar stolen represented a violation of the faith my parents had placed in him, faith that they had never extended to me despite my demonstrated responsibility and reliability. I created a detailed summary document that organized the information chronologically and categorically. The chronological view showed how the theft had evolved over time, starting with small occasional transfers and escalating to larger and more frequent withdrawals as Marco apparently became confident he would not be caught. The categorical view broke down the stolen funds by destination, showing how Marco had used the money for car payments, credit card bills, rent during periods when he claimed to be struggling financially, and discretionary purchases that included electronics, dining out, and entertainment expenses. The total came to $137,420, a sum that represented a substantial portion of my parents' retirement savings and business capital. This was money they had earned through decades of hard work, money they believed was secured in business accounts that would fund their later years. Marco had stolen their future financial security, while presenting himself as the loyal son who stayed close to family and supported their values. As I worked through the documentation, I found myself thinking about the $18,000 I had given Marco 2 years ago to pay off his debts. Those debts had been framed as the result of unemployment and unexpected expenses, circumstances beyond his control that required family assistance to resolve. Now I understood that those debts were likely the result of Marco's theft becoming insufficient to support his spending habits, forcing him to use credit cards to bridge the gap between the money he was stealing and the lifestyle he wanted to maintain. I had paid off debts that Marco had created through his own financial irresponsibility, while he was simultaneously stealing from our parents. The realization did not anger me as much as it clarified my thinking about family obligations and reciprocity. I had operated under the assumption that family members should help each other during genuine hardship, that those with resources should share with those in need, when the need was legitimate. Marco had exploited that assumption, manufacturing needs through theft and mismanagement while presenting himself as deserving of assistance. My parents had enabled this exploitation through their refusal to hold Marco accountable, their pattern of excusing his failures while demanding more from me. By mid-morning, I had completed my analysis and organization of the documentation. The question that remained was what to do with this information. I identified several possible courses of action, each with different implications and consequences. The first option was to do nothing, to keep the information to myself and allow my family to continue in their ignorance. This approach had the advantage of avoiding further conflict and allowing my parents to maintain their preferred beliefs about their son. However, it also meant allowing Marco to potentially continue stealing from them, perpetuating a fraud that was directly harming people I still cared about despite our estrangement. The passivity of this approach felt wrong, a form of complicity through silence. The second option was to provide the information directly to my parents and allow them to decide how to respond. This approach respected their autonomy and gave them agency in determining consequences for Marco's behavior. However, it also risked the possibility that they would rationalize or minimize the theft, finding ways to excuse Marco's behavior, just as they had excused every other failure and betrayal throughout his life. They might even blame me for bringing the information forward, shooting the messenger rather than addressing the message. The third option was to report Marco's theft to law enforcement and allow the legal system to address the crime. This approach had the advantage of imposing external consequences that my parents could not dismiss or negotiate away. However, it would almost certainly destroy any remaining possibility of family reconciliation and would cause my parents significant pain as they watched their son face criminal prosecution. The severity of this approach felt disproportionate to my goals, which were about establishing truth and protecting my parents rather than punishing Marco. The fourth option was a hybrid approach where I would first attempt to confront Marco directly, giving him an opportunity to acknowledge his theft and make restitution before I involved others. This approach aligned with principles of restorative justice, offering a path toward accountability that did not necessarily require legal intervention. However, it depended on Marco being capable of honesty and genuine remorse, qualities he had not demonstrated in any of our previous interactions. I spent much of that day thinking through these options and their implications. My decision-making process was complicated by competing values and priorities. I wanted my parents to know the truth about their financial struggles and about the son they had prioritized over me for decades. I wanted Marco to face consequences for his theft and manipulation. However, I also recognized that I did not want revenge, did not want to cause pain simply for the sake of punishment. What I wanted was truth, accountability, and protection for my parents from further exploitation. By late afternoon, I had reached a decision about my immediate next steps. I would not make any definitive moves until after the holidays had passed and after the partnership decision at my firm had been announced. The timing of Madison's revelation, coming in mid-December when holiday emotions ran high, and when I was in the middle of a critical professional transition, made immediate action inadvisable. I would use the intervening weeks to continue thinking through my approach, to seek counsel from trusted advisors, and to ensure that whatever action I took was thoughtful rather than reactive. This decision to wait felt strategic rather than cowardly. The information was documented and secured. Marco was no longer living in my home where he could cause me direct harm. My parents' business accounts could be monitored to detect any ongoing theft. There was no emergency requiring immediate action, and the complexity of the situation justified taking time to ensure I proceeded in ways I would not later regret. The following week brought the announcement I had been anticipating. Sandra called me into her office on a Tuesday morning and told me that the partners had voted unanimously to offer me the partnership position, leading the new cloud transformation practice. The role would begin officially in January, with a transition period during which I would complete my current client commitments while beginning to build the team and service framework for the new practice. The financial terms were generous, with an initial compensation package of $475,000 including base salary, profit sharing, and equity appreciation. The professional validation of the partnership offer felt particularly meaningful given the simultaneous rejection from my family. Here were people evaluating me purely on merit and demonstrated capability, seeing value in what I had built and trusting me to build something new. The contrast with family dynamics where I was valued only as a source of money and resources could not have been sharper. My professional community recognized and rewarded my contributions, while my family of origin punished me for refusing to be exploited. I accepted the partnership offer immediately, and spent the remainder of that week in meetings with other partners discussing the vision and implementation plan for the new practice. The work was energizing and forward-looking, requiring me to think strategically about market positioning, service delivery models, talent acquisition, and financial projections. The intellectual challenge engaged me fully, providing welcome distraction from the unresolved family situation that continued occupying the back of my mind. The holidays arrived with their characteristic mixture of commercialism and sentiment. I had been invited to spend Christmas with several different groups of friends and colleagues, people who recognized that I might be alone during a traditionally family-centered time, and who wanted to include me in their celebrations. I accepted an invitation from a colleague whose family welcomed me warmly into their Christmas Eve gathering, treating me as an honored guest rather than a charity case to be pitted for lacking family connections. The evening was genuinely pleasant, filled with good food, engaging conversation, and the easy warmth of people who had chosen to spend time together. Christmas Day itself I spent largely alone, which felt appropriate and restful rather than lonely. I took a long walk through my neighborhood in the morning, appreciating the quiet streets and the unseasonably mild weather. I cooked myself an elaborate meal, trying recipes I had been wanting to attempt but had not made time for during busy work periods. I video called with several friends who were spending the holiday with their own families, brief connections that reminded me I was part of multiple communities even if I was not part of my family of origin at this moment. The silence from my parents and Marco remained absolute throughout the holidays. I had not expected contact given the terms of our last interaction, but the complete absence of acknowledgement during a season traditionally associated with family reconciliation felt significant. They were maintaining their position that I had violated family obligations by evicting Marco, and that reconciliation would require me to apologize and accept whatever conditions they chose to impose. I was maintaining my position that I had enforced reasonable boundaries, and that any future relationship would need to be based on mutual respect, rather than exploitation. The new year arrived with its traditional sense of fresh beginnings and new possibilities. I officially began my role as a partner at the firm, moving into a larger office and beginning the process of hiring the team that would deliver cloud transformation services to mid-sized enterprise clients. The first weeks of January were consumed with recruiting activities, as I interviewed candidates for senior consultant and architect positions, while also meeting with potential clients to understand their needs and challenges. The work was demanding but satisfying, providing tangible evidence that I was building something significant and valuable. In late January, I received an unexpected call from my Aunt Rosa, the first contact from anyone in the family since the confrontation in early December. Rosa's voice on the phone was careful and tentative, suggesting she was aware she might not be welcome given the family estrangement. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me calling. I know things are complicated with your parents right now. I wanted to check on you and see how you're doing. Your mother mentioned you weren't at Christmas, and I've been worried about you." I appreciated Rosa's concern even while recognizing that she was likely calling with some agenda beyond simple welfare checking. Rosa had always been the family mediator, the person who tried to smooth over conflicts and restore equilibrium when relationships became strained. Her call almost certainly meant my parents had enlisted her to serve as an intermediary, testing whether I might be willing to reconcile on terms acceptable to them. "I'm doing well, actually," I told her honestly. "Work is going very well. I was just promoted to partner at my firm, and I'm building a new practice area. I spent the holidays with friends and colleagues, which was pleasant. How are you?" Rosa seemed slightly taken aback by my positive report, as though she had expected me to sound lonely or regretful about the family estrangement. "I'm glad to hear work is going well. Partnership is a significant achievement. You should be proud of what you've built." We talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics before Rosa circled back to the real purpose of her call. Elena, your parents are very hurt about this situation with Marco. They feel that you abandoned your brother when he needed family support, and they're struggling with the estrangement from you. Your mother cries frequently. Your father is angry, but I think underneath that anger he's sad about losing connection with you. I'm wondering whether there might be a way to repair these relationships, to find some path forward that works for everyone. I had anticipated this conversation or something like it and had thought carefully about how to respond. Rosa, I appreciate that you care about family relationships, and that you want everyone to get along. However, I think the characterization of this situation as me abandoning Marco is inaccurate. Marco lived in my home rent-free for 4 months, which was already longer than our original agreement. When I enforced the boundary we had established, he told me that if I didn't like the situation I could leave my own house. That statement revealed that he no longer saw himself as a guest receiving temporary help but rather as someone with equal or greater claim to my property. The eviction was a necessary response to that fundamental disrespect. I understand that must have been frustrating, Rosa said carefully, but family members sometimes say things in anger that they don't really mean. Perhaps if you had given him more time to understand the seriousness of the situation, he would have adjusted his behavior and his attitude. I gave him extensive time and multiple opportunities, I replied. The eviction notice provided 30 days, which he used not to find alternative housing but to recruit our parents to pressure me into canceling the eviction. When Mom and Dad came to my house uninvited to announce that Marco would be staying for another 6 months, and when Dad threatened to disown me if I didn't comply, they made clear that respecting my boundaries was less important to them than enabling Marco's continued dependence. Rosa was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her tone had shifted slightly. Your mother didn't tell me about that part. About them coming to your house or about the 6-month demand. She framed it as you suddenly deciding to evict Marco without warning or discussion. That's not what happened, I said firmly. And the fact that Mom misrepresented the situation when talking to you suggests that she knows their behavior was unreasonable, but doesn't want to acknowledge that even to family members. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Rosa gradually coming to understand that the situation was more complex than my parents had described to her. I did not mention Madison's documentation of Marco's theft, judging that this information needed to be handled carefully, and that involving Rosa at this stage would complicate matters unnecessarily. However, I did make clear that my position was based on principle rather than temporary anger, and that any future relationship with my parents would need to involve genuine respect for my boundaries, rather than assuming I would eventually capitulate to their demands. When the call ended, I felt reasonably confident that Rosa now understood my perspective more accurately, even if she might not fully agree with my choices. More importantly, the call had clarified my thinking about the path forward with my parents, and the role that Marco's theft would play in that path. I had initially considered keeping the information about Marco's theft separate from the boundary disputes about his residency in my home. However, Rosa's call made clear that my parents were constructing a narrative where I was the problem, where my supposed selfishness and lack of family feeling had caused the estrangement. That narrative needed to be corrected with facts, and the documentation of Marco's theft provided those facts in a form that could not easily be dismissed or rationalized away. I decided that I would provide the information to my parents directly, but in a format that gave them time to process it privately before any confrontation occurred. I would not simply show up at their home with accusations and evidence. Instead, I would send them a carefully prepared package that included the documentation, a detailed summary of what it revealed, and a letter explaining why I was bringing this information forward. This approach would give them the space to absorb the information, to verify its accuracy, and to decide how they wanted to respond without the pressure of my immediate presence. I spent several evenings preparing this package. The summary document laid out the timeline of Marco's theft, the total amount stolen, the methods he had used to access accounts and transfer funds, and the ways the theft correlated with his claims of financial hardship that had prompted both my financial assistance and his residency in my home. I organized the supporting documentation with clear labels and annotations so my parents could follow the evidence, even if they were not familiar with financial records and bank statements. The letter I included with the documentation was perhaps the most difficult piece to write. I needed to convey several complex messages simultaneously. I needed to explain that I was providing this information out of concern for their financial well-being rather than out of vindictiveness toward Marco. I needed to acknowledge that discovering this theft would be painful, while also making clear that they deserved to know the truth. I needed to establish that the theft contextualized the boundary disputes that had caused our estrangement, showing that my refusal to provide unlimited support had been wise rather than selfish. After multiple drafts, I settled on a letter that was direct but compassionate, factual but empathetic. The letter opened by acknowledging the estrangement and expressing regret that our family relationships had deteriorated to this point. It then explained that I had recently received information about Marco's financial activities that they needed to be aware of for their own protection. It summarized what the documentation revealed and encouraged them to verify the information independently through their own review of business accounts and records. It concluded by stating that I remained willing to have a relationship with them based on mutual respect and honest acknowledgement of what had occurred, but that such a relationship would require them to stop demanding that I provide unlimited support to Marco regardless of his behavior or the costs to me. I sent the package via certified mail to ensure delivery, and to have documentation that they had received it. The tracking showed delivery on a Tuesday afternoon in early February. I then waited to see how they would respond, knowing that the information I had provided would force them to confront truths they had apparently spent years avoiding. The first response came 3 days later in the form of a phone call from my mother. Her voice on the phone was strained and raw, suggesting she had been crying recently or extensively. "Elena, we received the package you sent. We need to talk about this in person. Can you come to the house this weekend?" "I'd prefer to meet on neutral ground," I said, not wanting to have this conversation in their space where they might feel territorial or defensive. "How about the coffee shop on Lamar near your house? Saturday afternoon?" My mother agreed reluctantly, and we set a time for 2 o'clock on Saturday. I spent the days leading up to that meeting preparing myself emotionally and strategically for what would likely be a difficult conversation. I reviewed the documentation again to ensure I could answer any questions about specific transactions or timelines. I thought through likely objections or rationalizations they might offer, and considered how I would respond to each. Most importantly, I reminded myself repeatedly that my goal was not to win an argument, or to force them to apologize but rather to establish truth as the foundation for any future relationship. Saturday arrived cold and overcast, weather that matched my emotional state as I drove to the coffee shop where we had agreed to meet. I arrived 15 minutes early and secured a table in a quiet corner where we could talk without being overheard by other customers. I ordered tea and sat waiting, watching the door and trying to manage my anxiety about the conversation to come. My parents arrived together at precisely 2 o'clock, suggesting they had planned their arrival carefully. They looked older than I remembered from our last interaction, my mother's face lined with stress and my father's shoulders carrying a defeated slump that was uncharacteristic for him. They ordered coffee at the counter and then joined me at the table, sitting across from me in a configuration that felt like a negotiation or confrontation rather than a family conversation. My father spoke first, his voice tired but controlled. "We've reviewed the documents you sent. We've also looked at our business accounts and confirmed the transactions you identified. The information appears to be accurate regarding the amounts and the transfers. I'm sorry to have had to bring this to your attention," I said carefully. "I know it must be painful to discover that Marco has been stealing from you. However, I felt you deserved to know the truth about why your business has been struggling financially, and about the person you've been protecting and supporting." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "How did you get this information? How long have you known about this?" "I received the documentation about 6 weeks ago from someone who had discovered it, and felt obligated to bring it forward. I've spent that time verifying the information and deciding how best to help you understand what's been happening." 6 weeks, my father said, his voice harder now. "You've known for 6 weeks that Marco was stealing from us, and you didn't tell us immediately?" I wanted to ensure the information was accurate, and to think carefully about how to present it in a way that would be helpful rather than simply destructive, I explained. I also needed time to process what this information meant about family dynamics, and about the ways you've treated Marco and me differently over the years. My mother leaned forward, her expression pleading. "Elena, I know you're angry about the situation with Marco living in your house. I know you feel we've favored him unfairly, but surely you can understand that discovering he's been stealing from us is devastating. We need to handle this as a family, to find a way to help Marco address whatever problems led him to do this terrible thing." The response was so predictable that I almost laughed, though there was nothing funny about the situation. Even confronted with evidence of systematic theft over years, my mother's instinct was to protect Marco, to frame his behavior as the result of problems that required family assistance, rather than as crimes that required accountability. "Marco doesn't need more help or more enabling," I said firmly. "What he needs is to face consequences for his actions. He's stolen nearly $140,000 from you over 4 years. That's not a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. That's systematic betrayal of your trust and theft of your financial security." My father's expression was conflicted, anger and pain warring visibly in his features. "What do you think we should do? Report our own son to the police? Have him arrested and prosecuted? Destroy his future over money?" "The question isn't what I think you should do," I replied. "This is your business, your money, and your decision about consequences. However, I think you should consider that Marco's future is being destroyed by his own choices, not by whatever consequences those choices produce. And I think you should consider how your pattern of protecting him from consequences has enabled him to reach this point where he feels entitled to steal from his own parents." We talked for nearly 2 hours, the conversation moving through cycles of anger, denial, rationalization, and occasional glimpses of painful recognition. My parents alternated between acknowledging the seriousness of Marco's theft and finding ways to minimize it or explain it away. They suggested that perhaps Marco had intended to pay the money back. They wondered whether the business accounting might be wrong, whether there might be legitimate explanations for some of the transfers. They asked whether I might be exaggerating the amounts or misinterpreting the transactions. I responded to each rationalization with patient reference to the documentation, showing them specific bank statements and transaction records that made the theft undeniable. I pointed out that Marco had never mentioned intending to repay the money, had never acknowledged taking it at all, and had in fact been living beyond his means while claiming poverty whenever he needed financial assistance from me or from them. Eventually, my father's anger seemed to crystallize into something approaching resolve. "We'll talk to Marco about this. We'll give him an opportunity to explain himself and to make things right. But Elena, this doesn't change what happened between you and him about your house. That situation still needs to be addressed." The statement revealed the depth of their unwillingness to connect the dots between Marco's theft and his sense of entitlement to my space. "Dad, those situations are completely connected," I said with as much patience as I could muster. "Marco told me I could leave my own house because he has spent his entire life learning that he's entitled to take what he wants without consequences. He stole from you for years because he knew you would never hold him accountable. He exploited my generosity because he expected me to be as enabling as you've always been. The theft and the boundary violations are manifestations of the same fundamental problem, which is that Marco has never been required to take responsibility for his choices." My mother shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. "You're being too harsh. He's your brother. He's our son. Family members don't give up on each other when there are problems. Family means forgiving and helping each other heal. Family also means respecting boundaries and not exploiting people who care about you," I countered. "I'm not giving up on Marco. I'm refusing to enable behavior that's harmful to him and to everyone around him. There's a difference." The conversation eventually wound down without any clear resolution. My parents acknowledged they needed to confront Marco about the theft, but could not commit to any specific consequences. They continued to express hope that I would reconsider my position about the eviction and about allowing Marco back into my life. I continued to maintain that any future relationship would require genuine accountability and changed behavior, not just promises and rationalizations. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, my mother reached across the table and took my hand. "Elena, regardless of everything else, I want you to know that I love you. I know we haven't always shown it in ways you needed, but you're my daughter and I love you." The statement brought tears to my eyes despite my determination to remain composed. "I love you too, Mom. But love without respect isn't enough to sustain a healthy relationship. I need you to respect my boundaries and my decisions, even when you don't agree with them. I need you to stop demanding that I sacrifice my well-being to accommodate Marco's refusal to take responsibility for his own life. We parted without concrete plans for future contact, leaving the relationship in the same uncertain state it had occupied for months. However, something had shifted during that conversation. The truth about Marco's theft was now known to my parents, and they would have to decide how to respond to it. The burden of denial and rationalization now rested with them rather than with me, and whatever they chose to do with that burden would reveal important information about whether genuine change was possible in our family dynamics. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.